The strength of silence. Narrator's perspective. I met him in the most unexpected place, a quiet monastery, tucked deep within the mountains of Bhutan. His name was Tenzing, and though he never spoke a word, his presence carried a weight I couldn't ignore. To this day, his story remains one of the greatest lessons I've ever witnessed. The boy who couldn't be still. Tenzing wasn't born into silence. He was once a restless, angry boy from a small village in the Paro Valley, where houses were stacked like steps on the mountainside. His father was a yak herder, a man hardened by years of bitter winds and thin air, while his mother wove traditional go garments, her hands always moving, always working. But Tenzing? He was different. He had too much fire in his blood. At school, he fought with the other boys. At home, he defied his father, refusing to wake up at dawn to tend to the animals. When his father scolded him, he would run into the hills and stay there for hours, watching the river carve its way through the valley below. He dreamed of leaving, of escaping the silence of the mountains for the noise of the world beyond. One evening, after a fight with his father, Tenzing ran further than ever before. When he finally stopped, he found himself standing before a monastery, a place he had always avoided. Monks in their maroon robes moved like shadows, their heads bowed in silent prayer. He stared at them, puzzled. How could people live like this, without shouting, without running, without fighting? He would never understand them. Or so he thought. The punishment that changed everything. The next day, his father made a decision that would change Tenzing's life forever. You want to waste your days fighting? If you cannot respect your home, you will learn discipline elsewhere. And just like that, Tenzing was sent to live at the monastery for a full year. At first he resisted. The silence was unbearable. The days started before sunrise, with the sound of a wooden gong echoing across the valley. The monks moved in quiet, deliberate motions, washing their robes, sweeping the courtyards, preparing tea, all without speaking a word. For Tenzing, it felt like torture. He wanted to scream just to break the stillness, but the monks had rules. Every time he broke the silence, he was given another task. Chop wood, carry water, meditate until his legs went numb. If he refused, they simply waited. No punishments, no anger, just patience. Slowly, something inside him began to shift. The hardest battle one morning. As he carried buckets of water up the stone steps, he saw a young monk, no older than himself, meditating in the cold. The wind whipped through the courtyard, stinging like a blade, but the monk did not move. Tenzing watched, fascinated. How? How could someone endure so much discomfort and not flinch? That night he asked an elder monk, breaking his silence for the first time in weeks. How does he do it? How does he not feel the cold? The monk smiled. He feels it. He just does not react. Tenzing frowned. But how? The elder pointed to his own temple. The body screams, but the mind decides whether to listen. That single sentence changed everything. From that day on, Tenzing began training, not his fists, but his mind. He started with meditation, but it was excruciating. His legs burned, his thoughts ran wild. But each time he wanted to move, he forced himself to sit a little longer. Then came the real challenge, the night of silence. Each winter, the monastery selected a few monks to spend an entire night meditating outside, exposed to the freezing winds. No blankets, no fire, just their robes and their minds. Most monks spent years preparing. Tenzing had only been at the monastery for 8 months, but when the elder monks asked for volunteers, he stepped forward. They tried to warn him. The cold is not like anything you have known. You must be ready. But he simply bowed. The night of silence. The wind howled through the mountains as Tenzing sat cross-legged on the stone floor, his breath forming tiny clouds in the air. At first it was just cold. Then came the pain. His fingers, his toes, his ears all burning, then numbing. Yes, he stepped forward. His body screamed at him to move, to huddle, to seek warmth. But he didn't. Instead, he remembered what the elder monk had told him. The body screams, but the mind decides. So he closed his eyes and decided. He imagined warmth. He visualized himself sitting by the fire in his family's home, hearing his mother's voice, feeling the heat on his skin. Hours passed. The wind howled, but he did not move. By sunrise, when the monks came to check on him, he was still there. His lips were blue, his hands stiff, but his eyes were calm. He had won the battle, not against the cold, but against himself. A different man. When Tenzing returned home a year later, he was unrecognizable. His father expected the same defiant boy to return, but the fire in his eyes had changed. It was no longer wild. It was controlled, focused. He no longer argued, no longer fought. When others tried to provoke him, he simply smiled. One day, a group of boys who used to challenge him to fights tried again. They pushed him, insulted him, daring him to react. But Tenzing did nothing, not because he was weak, but because he no longer needed to prove his strength. Final words from the narrator. Years later, I returned to Bhutan and visited the monastery again. I saw Tenzing, not as a restless boy, but as a man, a monk, a teacher. I asked him if he ever missed his old life, the noise, the fights. He simply smiled and said, "The strongest man in the room is the one who does not need to raise his voice." Themes and cultural elements in the story. Real-life setting. Bhutan, a country known for its monasteries and Buddhist traditions. Authentic customs. The silent discipline of monks. Meditative endurance. Deep-rooted respect for patience. Believable character growth. A wild, undisciplined boy transforms through mental training and hardship. Emotional depth. The struggle of resisting instincts, learning control, and finding peace through discipline.